Captain had commanded the Mercy's Dawn for 7 years, and in that time he had never fired a single weapon. The medical frigate was humanity's most advanced healing vessel, a monument to compassion in an age of warfare. Its white hull gleamed beneath the distant light of Prime, emblazoned with the universal Red Cross that meant sanctuary across 1,000 worlds. No species, no matter how brutal or militaristic, violated the sanctity of a hospital ship. That was the covenant of the stars, the one law that transcended all others. But as stared at his tactical display, watching 3 collective dreadnoughts move into formation around his vessel, he felt the first cold tendrils of dread creeping up his spine. The Mercy's Dawn currently housed 347 souls, 214 human medical personnel, doctors, nurses, surgical technicians, researchers who had dedicated their lives to healing, 123 wounded soldiers, 87 human marines who had been critically injured in the fighting at Sector 7, and 36 soldiers whose species had been bitter enemies of humanity just 72 hours ago. And 6 civilians, refugees from a station that had caught fire during the ceasefire negotiations, people who had nowhere else to go. Dr. Sarah was in Medical Bay 3, standing over the regeneration chamber of a soldier named. The creature was magnificent and terrible to behold, 4 muscular limbs, a chitinous exoskeleton that shimmered like dark bronze, and compound eyes that seemed to hold ancient intelligence. 2 of its limbs had been severed at the elbow in a reactor explosion aboard his own vessel. Sarah had spent the last 3 days fighting to save his life, to preserve what remained of him so that reconstructive surgery would be possible. Had been an enemy, his squadron had attacked a human research station, killing 47 people. Sarah remembered reading the casualty reports, remembering the photographs of the dead, but she also remembered her oath to heal without judgment, to preserve life without question, to treat the wounded regardless of what atrocities they may have committed. That was what made her human. That was what separated them from the collective. Captain's voice crackled through the ship's communication system, summoning Sarah to the bridge. She noted the tension in his tone. Something was wrong, very wrong. As she made her way through the corridors, Sarah passed through the wards. In one chamber, a human medic named Doctor was checking vital signs on a young human soldier, barely 19 years old, whose lower half had been destroyed by a plasma burst. The soldier was sedated, dreaming peacefully, unaware of the amputation they would wake to. In another chamber, 3 patients lay in stasis, their bodies slowly healing with the aid of advanced biological technology. These were vulnerable people, defenseless people, people who had placed their trust in humanity's commitment to the Covenant. When Sarah reached the bridge, she immediately understood the danger. The 3 collective dreadnoughts had changed course. They were no longer approaching from a distance. They were moving to encircle the Mercy's Dawn, cutting off every escape vector. Captain's face was pale, his hands gripping the armrests of his command chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "They're hailing us," the communications officer said, his voice trembling. "Admiral wants to speak with you, with both of you." The holographic image that materialized on the bridge was like nothing Sarah had ever seen. Admiral was a collective commander, a being whose very physiology seemed designed for warfare. His exoskeleton was from countless battles, his mandibles were yellowed and ancient, and his compound eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was utterly, completely devoid of mercy. Captain's voice came through the translator, smooth and deliberate and absolutely terrifying. "Doctor, I trust you have received our message." "We're a medical vessel," said firmly. "Protected under the Covenant, we're transporting wounded from both sides to the neutral zone. This is a sanctuary." His mandibles clicked, and Sarah realized with horror that he was laughing. "The Covenant is dead, Captain, and you are about to learn why." Holographic image of Admiral filled the bridge of the Mercy's Dawn, his massive form towering over the crew like a predator looming over prey. Captain felt every eye on him, felt the weight of 347 lives depending on his next decision. His jaw clenched as he forced himself to maintain eye contact with the collective commander, refusing to show the fear that was rapidly consuming him. "The Covenant protects all medical vessels," said, his voice steady despite the chaos beginning to unfold in his mind. "It's been in effect for 300 years. Every civilization, every species has sworn to honor it. That includes the collective." His mandibles clicked again, that horrible, obscene sound of laughter. "The Covenant is a human invention, Captain. a construct designed to protect human weakness. Your species created it because you lack the strength to face your enemies directly in combat. So instead, you hide behind sanctimony, behind false morality, claiming that compassion is a virtue while it is, in fact, a fatal flaw. On the tactical display behind, the dreadnoughts were moving into attack formation. Weapons systems were powering up, their energy signatures growing stronger with each passing second. The Mercy's Dawn had minimal defenses, just enough shielding to protect against radiation and micrometeorites. Against 3 capital-class collective warships, the frigate was completely helpless. "What do you want?" Sarah demanded, stepping forward. Her medical training had taught her to assess threats and calculate survival probabilities. Every instinct she possessed was screaming at her that this situation was spiraling toward catastrophe. "We want what is ours," replied coldly. "Aboard your vessel are soldiers who participated in the massacre at Collective Station 7. Soldiers who murdered 3,000 of our people, civilians, scientists, engineers, children. They bombed our medical facilities. They committed atrocities that violated every principle of warfare." "Those soldiers are wounded," Sarah said, her voice rising. "Many of them are in critical condition. If you move them, they'll die. You know this." "Yes," said simply, "and they deserve to die. But more than that, they deserve to be executed by collective hands. They deserve to understand that there are consequences for their crimes. They deserve to suffer." Captain's hands had unconsciously moved to the comm controls. His mind was racing, calculating possibilities. They couldn't outrun the dreadnoughts. The Mercy's Dawn had been designed for healing, not combat. Its engines could achieve decent velocity, but the collective vessels were faster, more agile, more lethal in every conceivable way. But they could transmit. They could send a message. They could broadcast what was happening to the rest of human space. They could ensure that if this vessel was destroyed, the crime would be witnessed by billions. "I'm ordering you to surrender the soldiers," continued, his tone becoming almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than orchestrating mass murder. "You have 5 minutes to transfer them to our docking bay. If you comply, the human personnel and the civilian passengers will be allowed to escape. If you refuse..." The Admiral's compound eyes seemed to gleam with anticipation. "Then I will demonstrate to the galaxy what happens when inferior species challenge collective authority." His fingers moved across the controls, initiating a continuous broadcast. Everything that happened in the next moments would be recorded. Everything would be transmitted. There would be no hiding this crime, no sanitized official narrative, no way for the collective to deny what they were about to do. "I need to speak with my medical director," said, stalling for time. "I need to discuss the logistics of transferring critically wounded patients." "You have 4 minutes," replied. The holographic image flickered and vanished, returning control of the bridge to the horrified crew. Sarah stared at, her dark eyes wide with understanding. He was going to refuse. He was going to sacrifice the ship, possibly sacrifice everyone aboard, rather than hand over the wounded to execution. It was the most human thing could possibly do, and it was about to trigger a cascade of events that would reshape the entire galactic order. The moment the holographic image of Admiral vanished, Captain's command became crystal clear. They were not surrendering. Not today. Not ever. Sarah understood this with absolute certainty the instant she looked into his eyes, had made a calculation that transcended military strategy or survival probability. He had chosen principle over expediency, and that choice meant death for all of them. "Dr. Medical Bay 3 now," commanded through the internal comm system. "All medical personnel implement emergency lockdown protocols. I'm sealing the lower decks." Sarah ran. Her legs carried her through corridors that were already beginning to show signs of stress. Lights flickering, alarms beginning to sound as the Mercy's Dawn detected the massive energy buildup in the weapons systems of the surrounding dreadnoughts. She could feel the ship shuddering beneath her feet, could sense the growing instability in the vessel's systems. When she reached Medical Bay 3, she found chaos in controlled motion. Doctor was already moving patients, transferring the most critical cases into reinforced interior compartments away from the outer hull. The young human soldier with the amputated legs was being moved on a stasis bed, still unconscious, unaware that his sanctuary had transformed into a death trap. But it was the soldier named who shocked Sarah into stillness. Despite being sedated, despite having lost 2 limbs, despite being one of the most critically wounded patients aboard the vessel, was conscious. Somehow, through the medication and the pain, he had awakened. His 4 remaining limbs were moving with desperate purpose as he dragged himself from his regeneration chamber, his chitinous exoskeleton scraping against the medical bay floor. "Stop," Sarah rushed toward him. "You're going to reopen your wounds." "Must fight," he clicked, his translator rendering the sounds into harsh, determined English. "You protect my people, I protect yours." Sarah stared at the creature, the enemy she had spent 3 days keeping alive, the warrior whose species had attacked human settlements, the being whose very presence on this ship represented the tentative peace that was now shattering around them. And in that moment, she understood something profound about consciousness, about morality, about the capacity for honor that transcended species boundaries. "Get him a weapon," she told. The medical bay transformed into a fortress, secured the entrance with reinforced bulkheads, creating layered defensive positions. The human Marines who had been recovering in the medical wards, men and women with missing limbs, with burn injuries, with wounds that should have kept them incapacitated for months, began to arm themselves. Plasma torches were repurposed as weapons. Structural supports were converted into makeshift barriers. And then the explosions began. The first volley from the collective dreadnoughts was devastating. The Mercy's Dawn had never been designed to withstand weapons fire. The shields, intended to protect against radiation and solar flares, were inadequate against directed energy weapons. The starboard side of the ship erupted in a cascade of fire and destruction. An entire section of the vessel depressurized instantly, killing everyone in that compartment. The impact threw Sarah to the floor. Around her, medical equipment crashed down, IV stands toppled, and the carefully maintained sterility of the medical environment shattered into chaos. But the bulkhead doors held. The lower decks remained sealed. Captain had designed the ship's internal architecture specifically to preserve the medical sections in case of catastrophic damage. He had anticipated this. Not this exact scenario, but the principle that sometimes a ship's most important cargo needed to be protected at all costs. The second volley struck closer. Sarah could hear the tortured sound of metal screaming as the structural integrity of the ship was compromised. Through the transparent aluminum viewports in Medical Bay 3, she could see space itself, the infinite void studded with stars, now streaked with the terrible light of weapons fire. Positioned himself at the barricade, his massive form filling the entrance. His remaining limbs were steady. His compound eyes were fixed on the sealed door that separated them from the rest of the ship. "When they come," he clicked, "we show them what honor means." The third volley tore through the central spine of the Mercy's Dawn. The ship's systems were failing. Power was flickering. Life support was struggling to maintain breathable atmosphere. And above it all, Captain's voice came through the comm system, calm and steady and absolutely certain. "All hands, this is the Captain. We are Terran. We do not abandon the wounded. We do not betray the sacred. We hold this line for the Covenant, for humanity, for everyone aboard this vessel." And then, with deliberate precision, initiated the ship-wide broadcast. Everything, every moment of the attack, every atrocity, every violation, was being transmitted outward at maximum power. The message was burning across space like a beacon of accusation, impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. The Mercy's Dawn was dying, but her testimony would live forever. Admiral Rachel Torres stood in the grand ballroom of Earth's Central Command, surrounded by the elite of human military leadership. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the assembled crowd as orchestra music drifted through the cavernous space. Politicians mingled with generals. Scientists celebrated with engineers. The ceasefire with the collective had been declared official just hours ago, and humanity was finally allowing itself to exhale after 3 years of brutal warfare. Torres herself was dressed in formal whites, her dress uniform decorated with medals and commendations earned through decisive victories across 17 star systems. She held a crystalline flute of champagne, nodded politely at the congratulations of well-wishers, and tried desperately to feel the joy that everyone around her seemed to be experiencing. Instead, she felt empty. War was ending, but something inside her knew that another kind of conflict was just beginning. Her adjutant, Commander James Riley, approached through the crowd, his expression grim and controlled. Only Torres recognized the subtle signs of urgency in his posture, the slight tension in his jaw. "Admiral, we need to talk," Riley said quietly. Tors excused herself and followed Riley to a private anteroom adjacent to the ballroom. The moment the door closed, Riley activated a holographic display, and the celebration of Earth's peace shattered like glass. The feed was from the Mercy's Dawn. Captain's face appeared on the display, bloodied and terrified, his voice cutting through the recorded chaos of the dying ship. Behind him, explosions erupted in brilliant orange and white. The sounds of weapons fire and dying crew members created a symphony of horror. "Admiral has declared the Covenant void," his recorded voice said, each word carrying the weight of finality. "The Mercy's Dawn is under attack. Medical personnel are sheltering the wounded. Request immediate." The transmission fractured into static and electromagnetic noise. Tors felt something inside her crystallize. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the polished floor, its destruction somehow a fitting metaphor for the world she had been celebrating moments before. "How long ago?" she demanded. 4 minutes, ma'am," Riley replied. "The signal took 40 seconds to reach us. The Mercy's Dawn went dark approximately 3 minutes and 20 seconds ago. Based on the weapon's signatures visible in the final transmissions, we have to assume." He didn't need to finish. Tors already understood. The ship was gone. All 347 people aboard were almost certainly dead. The collective had committed an atrocity so profound, so deliberate, that it transcended war crimes. It was an act of ideological violence, a statement that the rules humanity had fought to establish meant nothing. "Get me the President," Tors said, her voice carrying the cold certainty of command. "Get me every military asset within 2 light years of those coordinates. Get me fighter squadrons, destroyer fleets, cruiser groups, everything." And Riley. "Yes, Admiral." "Get me the video feeds, full transmissions from the Mercy's Dawn, everything recorded, everything he transmitted. I want to see what they did." Tors moved through the corridors of command headquarters like a woman possessed. Behind her, Riley was already working his communication devices, activating protocols that would set the entire human military apparatus into motion. The celebration in the grand ballroom continued for another 3 minutes before someone realized that Admiral Tors had left. Then, slowly, word began to spread. Something had happened. Something terrible. By the time Tors reached the Strategic Command Center, military installations across human space were already going into overdrive. The Ninth Fleet, stationed in deep space near the sector, received emergency orders to jump toward the last known coordinates of the Mercy's Dawn. Fighter squadrons were scrambled from orbital platforms. Weapon systems on deep space stations were brought online. Humanity was transforming from a celebrating civilization into a military machine. Tors stood before the holographic display, watching the recorded final moments of the Mercy's Dawn over and over again. She watched as collective boarding pods breached the medical frigate's hull. She watched as collective soldiers, heavily armed and utterly professional, moved through the corridors with the precision of trained killers. She watched as they systematically targeted the medical bays. And she watched as human medical personnel, doctors, nurses, technicians with no weapons, with no combat training, positioned themselves between the collective soldiers and their wounded patients. She watched as they died, protecting the sacred principle that the wounded were never, ever to be targeted. The President appeared on a secure hollow channel, her expression ashen. "Admiral, what happened?" "The collective murdered 347 people," Tors said quietly. "They violated the Covenant. They executed wounded soldiers and murdered medical personnel, and they did it deliberately with full knowledge of what they were doing." "What do you recommend?" the President asked. Tors took a deep breath. She had spent her entire military career learning to calculate probabilities, to assess threats, to make decisions that would determine the fates of millions. But this moment required something beyond military calculation. It required a statement of values so profound that it would reshape human civilization itself. "We respond," Tors said, "not with overwhelming force designed to annihilate. We respond with justice. We respond with restraint. We respond in a way that proves we are fundamentally different from them." The President nodded slowly, understanding the magnitude of what Tors was proposing. "Then make it so," the President said. And with those words, a new age began. The Ninth Fleet emerged from hyperspace like an avenging god, 17 warships materializing in perfect formation around the coordinates where the Mercy's Dawn had transmitted its final message. The lead ship, the Intrepid Horizon, was a dreadnought-class vessel. a military marvel of human engineering designed to project power across entire star systems. Behind it came cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, all moving with the synchronized precision of a force that had trained for exactly this scenario. Admiral's 3 dreadnoughts detected the human arrival almost instantaneously. For a moment, there was silence on the communications channels, a moment of comprehension, of realization that their gamble had catastrophically failed. The collective had anticipated a response, yes, but they had calculated that human reinforcements would take hours to arrive. They had expected to have time to escape, to disappear into hyperspace before any meaningful opposition could materialize. They had not expected humanity to respond this quickly. They had not expected this level of force concentration. On the bridge of the intrepid Horizon, Admiral Rachel Torres stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the tactical display as it updated in real time. The 3 collective dreadnoughts were attempting to activate their hyperdrive engines, desperate to flee before the human fleet could close the distance. But Torres had already anticipated this move. "All ships' weapons hot," she commanded, her voice carrying the weight of 347 deaths. "I want those dreadnoughts locked down, full sensor sweep on all 3 vessels, and get me a communication channel to Admiral." "Ma'am," her tactical officer said, "we're within range. We can destroy them with a single coordinated strike. Probability of success exceeds 98%. Tor's jaw tightened. She could order the annihilation of those 3 ships. She could order their complete obliteration, transforming them into expanding clouds of superheated plasma and debris. The galaxy would understand. The coalition worlds would celebrate. Humanity would have avenged the violation with overwhelming force. But that wasn't what she was going to do. "Negative," Torres said coldly. "I want precision strikes. Target their weapon systems first, then their hyperdrive engines, then their shield generators. I want those ships crippled, not destroyed. I want them helpless." Her tactical officer's eyes widened. "Admiral, with respect, those are hostile vessels, full military protocol." "I am aware of military protocol, Commander," Torres interrupted. "Execute my orders." The human fleet moved with terrible efficiency. The intrepid Horizon and 2 accompanying cruisers focused their fire on the lead collective dreadnought, systematically disabling its weapons arrays. Plasma cannons erupted in brilliant bursts of energy, each one precisely calibrated to destroy military systems while leaving the vessel's hull structurally intact. The collective ship's defensive systems tried to compensate, tried to redistribute power and raise shields, but they were facing a coordinated assault from 3 capital-class human warships piloted by commanders who had spent years studying collective tactics. The first dreadnought's weapons went dark. Its hyperdrive flickered and died. Its shield generators overloaded and burned out. Within 4 minutes, the ship hung in space like a helpless whale, its engines cold, its weapons inert, its crew alive but utterly powerless. The second and third dreadnoughts received the same treatment. By the time the human fleet had finished its attack run, all 3 collective warships were disabled, floating in the void, their crews watching in stunned disbelief as the human vessels moved into position around them. Admiral's final transmission was a howl of rage and incomprehension. "Why don't you destroy us? You have us. You have overwhelming firepower. Why do you hesitate?" Torres answered him personally, her voice carrying across the communications channels for all 3 collective vessels to hear. "Because execution would be mercy, Admiral. Because destruction would be an ending, and you deserve something far worse. You're going to stand trial. You're going to answer for what you did aboard the Mercy's Dawn, and the entire galaxy is going to watch as we prove that justice transcends vengeance." His response was a torrent of collective language, clicks and chittering and sounds that the translator couldn't process. But underneath the fury, Torres could detect something else. Fear, raw, primal fear. The collective had faced human military might before. They had lost battles, lost ships, lost soldiers. But they had never faced human justice, and they had no framework for understanding it. Torres turned to her communications officer. "Begin tractor beam operations. I want those ships secured and brought into custody. And transmit a message to Earth Command and the Coalition. The Mercy's Dawn has been avenged. Now begins the trial." As the human fleet moved into position around the disabled dreadnoughts, tractor beams engaging and energy shackles locking down the collective vessels, Torres allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The line had been crossed, and humanity's response was not to obliterate the line crosser. It was to make absolutely certain that the entire galaxy understood the cost of that transgression. The blockade that would isolate the collective from galactic commerce, from scientific collaboration, from cultural exchange, was already being coordinated by the coalition governments. The trial that would expose their crimes to the scrutiny of billions was already being prepared. The message that humanity did not respond to betrayal with annihilation, but with something far more terrible, the unshakable certainty of justice, was already being transmitted across known space. The collective would survive, but they would survive in isolation, in the eternal knowledge that they had crossed a line and paid a price that would shape their civilization for generations to come. The tribunal convened on the neutral station Accord, a massive orbital platform suspended in geosynchronous orbit above the planet that had given the Covenant of the Stars its name 300 years prior. The chamber itself was an architectural masterpiece. White stone walls that seemed to glow with an inner luminescence, transparent aluminum ceilings that revealed the infinite expanse of space beyond, and galleries that rose in ascending tiers to accommodate representatives from 67 separate species. Admiral sat in the defendant's chair, flanked by 12 legal representatives provided by the collective government. His chitinous exoskeleton seemed somehow smaller in the vast chamber, diminished by the weight of accusation that surrounded him. The holofeeds broadcasting the trial were being transmitted across known space in real time, ensuring that billions of beings could witness humanity's response to the violation of the Covenant. The prosecutor was Dr. Sarah herself, the survivor of the Mercy's dawn, the woman who had stood in Medical Bay 3 as the ship died around her. She moved through the chamber with the precise grace of a healer, not the aggressive posturing of a warrior seeking vengeance. This was deliberate. Every gesture, every word, every moment of her presentation was designed to demonstrate that humanity's response to atrocity was measured, thoughtful, and utterly devastating in its clarity. "The evidence before this tribunal is irrefutable," Sarah began, her voice carrying through the chamber and across the holofeed channels. "The video recordings from the Mercy's dawn show every moment of the attack, every decision, every deliberate targeting of medical personnel, every execution of wounded soldiers. There is no ambiguity here. There is no room for interpretation or legal maneuvering." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle into the consciousness of every being watching. "But before I present the evidence, I want to speak about the victims, not as statistics, not as abstract concepts of loss, but as individuals, as people, as beings whose lives had meaning and value." What followed was methodical testimony. Sarah described Dr., the ship's chief medical officer, a human who had pioneered regenerative techniques that had saved thousands of lives across multiple species. She described Nurse Jennifer Torres, a woman who had volunteered to treat collective patients even during the height of the war, believing that compassion transcended conflict. She described Dr., whose research into cross-species biology had opened new possibilities for healing creatures that had never before been treated by human medicine. She described the young human soldier whose name was David, who had been 17 years old and recovering from the amputation of both his legs. She described the 3 patients who had been in stasis, their bodies slowly healing with the aid of advanced technology, trusting in human medical expertise to restore them to functionality. And then, in a moment that shocked the courtroom into absolute silence, she spoke about the 7 collective soldiers who had defected. During the boarding of the Mercy's dawn, 7 members of the collective assault team refused to fire on medical personnel, Sarah said quietly. 7 members of a military culture dedicated to absolute obedience, to unwavering loyalty to the command structure, chose instead to refuse orders. They chose conscience over duty. They chose morality over hierarchy. She turned to face directly. "This tells me something profoundly important. It tells me that even within the collective, even within your rigid structure and your culture of absolute command obedience, the capacity for moral reasoning exists. That conscience is possible. That even your own soldiers understood on some fundamental level that what they were being ordered to do was wrong." His mandibles stopped their constant clicking. His compound eyes seemed to flicker with something that might have been doubt, might have been comprehension of the trap that was being laid. The evidence presentation lasted 3 days. Video footage from the Mercy's dawn was displayed in crystalline clarity, the targeting of the medical bays, the execution of wounded soldiers, the systematic destruction of life support systems. The cold calculation of genocide disguised as military necessity. Every moment was captured, analyzed, and presented to the tribunal with meticulous precision. But it was not Sarah's testimony about the atrocities that would prove most damaging. It was her cross-examination of himself. "Admiral," Sarah asked, standing before the defendant's chair, "do you believe the Covenant of the Stars has value?" Hesitated, his legal team whispered urgent advice, but the Admiral seemed compelled to respond. "The Covenant is a construct designed to constrain military power," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked," Sarah said. "I asked if you believed it has value, yes or no." "No," replied, his mandibles clicking with what might have been defiance. "It is a weakness masquerading as principle." "And yet," Sarah continued, moving closer, "you signed it. The collective signed the covenant 300 years ago. You committed your civilization to honoring it. Why would you commit to something you believed to be a weakness?" Silence was answer enough. "Because," Sarah said, answering her own question, "you understood that stability in civilization requires some agreements that transcend military advantage. You understood that a galaxy where hospitals could be attacked, where medical personnel could be murdered with impunity, where the wounded were not protected, such a galaxy would collapse into chaos that would benefit no one." She paused, her dark eyes meeting the collective admiral's compound gaze. "You signed the covenant knowing its value, and then you violated it anyway. You made a calculation that the collective was strong enough to act with impunity. You were wrong." The tribunal deliberated for 3 weeks. The verdict, when it came, shocked many observers. Admiral was found guilty of crimes against the Covenant, violations of interstellar law, and premeditated genocide. His sentence, 50 human years in minimum security confinement with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The other officers received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. It was merciful by the standards of most galactic species, and that mercy was the most terrible aspect of the judgment because it demonstrated that humanity was not acting from rage but from principle. They could have demanded execution. They could have imposed sentences of life imprisonment. Instead, they offered rehabilitation. And in offering rehabilitation, they demonstrated absolute certainty in their moral authority. They were so confident that they were right that they could afford to be merciful. They were so secure in their principles that they could afford to forgive. And that certainty made them infinitely more dangerous than any species in the galaxy had ever imagined. 5 years after the Mercy's dawn, Sarah found herself standing on the surface of a collective colony world, staring at children whose ribs were visible through their skin. The economic sanctions that humanity had imposed on the collective civilization had been comprehensive and devastating. Trade networks that had sustained collective commerce for centuries had been rerouted around their territory. Scientific collaboration had been suspended. Cultural exchanges had ceased. The blockade was not a military containment. It was an economic strangulation that was slowly suffocating an entire civilization. The colony of Prime had once been a thriving agricultural center, feeding millions across collective space. Now it was dying. The sanctions had made it impossible to import the specialized fertilizers and genetic seed stock that their agriculture depended upon. Crop yields had declined by 70% in the 5 years since the trial. The population was experiencing widespread malnutrition. Children were developing deficiency diseases that should have been eradicated 1,000 years ago. Sarah had come as part of a humanitarian mission authorized by the Coalition Medical Corps. She was treating the sick regardless of species, regardless of their civilization's crimes, because that was what a healer did. But something was crystallizing in her consciousness as she worked, something that troubled her deeply. The young girl she was examining couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her collective physiology was adapted for survival in harsh environments, her chitinous exoskeleton reinforced to withstand extremes of temperature and radiation. But even that hardy biology had limits. The child was malnourished, her compound eyes dull with the fog of hunger and exhaustion. "What's your name?" Sarah asked gently, working through a translation matrix to convert her words into collective clicks and chirps. The girl responded weakly, "My father was a scientist before the blockade." "What happened to your father?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "He stopped eating," the girl said simply. "So my mother and I would have more food. He died 2 years ago." Sarah sat back, her medical training warring with her conscience. Objectively, she understood the strategic calculation behind the blockade. It was designed to pressure the collective government into compliance, to demonstrate the cost of violating the covenant, to ensure that no civilization would ever consider crossing that line again. It was effective. The collective economy was collapsing. Their government was becoming increasingly unstable. Their population was suffering. But was the suffering of innocent children a price worth paying? That evening, in her temporary quarters on or Prime, Sarah composed a message to President Elizabeth. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if her conscience was finally breaking through the barriers of military strategy and political necessity that had been constructed around it. 5 years ago, we learned that the galaxy had fewer rules than we believed. The collective violated the covenant, and we responded with both justice and restraint. We were right to do so, but I fear we are beginning to use that righteous response as justification for something darker. I have treated collective patients whose families are starving due to the blockade. I have seen collective engineers and scientists and teachers, people who had nothing to do with the Mercy's dawn, suffer for the sins of their military leadership. We made a choice to be better than the collective, to maintain our moral authority by refusing to commit atrocities in response to theirs. But moral authority cannot be maintained through indefinite punishment. Justice is not the same as vengeance. Mercy cannot be a weapon. If we continue down this path, we will not have proven that humanity is superior to the collective. We will only have proven that humanity is more patient in its cruelty. Admiral sits in a comfortable detention facility, receiving adequate nutrition and medical care. Meanwhile, innocent collective citizens are dying of starvation and preventable disease. This is not justice. This is hypocrisy, and if we allow it to continue, we will betray everything the Mercy's dawn represented. It is time to open talks about transitioning from blockade to rehabilitation. It is time to offer the collective a path forward, not because we are weak, but because we are strong. We can afford to forgive because we have nothing left to prove. She sent the message before she could second-guess herself, knowing that it would be controversial, knowing that it would anger military hawks and those who had lost loved ones in the war, knowing that it challenged the fundamental narrative of human superiority that had been constructed around the response to the Mercy's dawn. The message spread across human space like wildfire. News networks debated it obsessively. Military strategists condemned it as naive idealism. Families of the dead demanded that Sarah be stripped of her citizenship. But something shifted in the collective human consciousness. The certainty that had seemed so justified 5 years ago began to fracture. President, displaying political courage that matched Admiral Tor's military decision-making, began quietly opening back-channel negotiations with the collective. She initiated discussions about transitioning from total blockade to selective trade reopening. She proposed scientific collaboration in the fields of agriculture and medicine. She offered rehabilitation programs instead of indefinite punishment. It was a gamble, it was controversial, but it was also profoundly human, the demonstration that strength was not the absence of compassion, but the triumph of it. That true power lay not in the ability to destroy or to punish indefinitely, but in the ability to offer forgiveness without losing vigilance, to show mercy without abandoning justice. Slowly, carefully, the blockade began to loosen. Trade routes were cautiously reopened. Agricultural assistance was provided to colonies on the brink of famine. Medical technology was shared to address the epidemic diseases that had emerged during the 5 years of isolation. The collective, transformed by exile and shame, began to change. They were not rehabilitated, that would take generations, but they were given a chance to prove they could be better. And in being given that chance, humanity demonstrated something far more powerful than military might or economic leverage. They demonstrated the courage to forgive. 20 years after the Mercy's dawn, a massive space station was inaugurated in orbit around Earth. The Mercy's Dawn Memorial Hospital and Institute of Healing Sciences was a testament to human commitment to the principles that had nearly died with the original ship. The station was vast, sprawling across 3 kilometers of orbital space, constructed from materials salvaged from the wreckage of the destroyed frigate and blended with the finest materials humanity and its allies could produce. The outer hull was inscribed with 347 names, every person who had died aboard the original Mercy's Dawn. The letters were enormous, readable from a distance of 1,000,000 kilometers, a permanent accusation against the darkness of space itself. This was not a monument designed to celebrate victory. This was a monument designed to remember sacrifice, to honor principle, and to ensure that no generation would forget the cost of violating the sacred. Dr. Sarah stood in the central chamber of the memorial, surrounded by representatives from every species in the coalition. The ceremony was being broadcast across known space, watched by billions of beings from 1,000 different worlds. 67 species had sent delegations to witness this moment, the dedication of a facility that would serve as both hospital and school, both healing center and beacon of moral authority. Beside Sarah stood the figure that no one had expected to attend, ambassador of the collective. The young collective was unburdened by the crimes of his predecessors, representing a new generation that had grown up in the shadow of the trial, educated by a civilization that had been forced to reckon with its own capacity for atrocity. His mandibles clicked with what the translators rendered as profound respect. "We gather to remember," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years of reflection, of watching a civilization attempt redemption, of witnessing the slow, painful transformation of a species that had committed unthinkable crimes. "We gather to honor those who died not in combat, but in sanctuary. We gather to acknowledge that the rules we created to protect the vulnerable can be broken, and that when they are broken, the consequences echo across generations." She turned to face the assembly, her dark eyes reflecting the light streaming through the transparent aluminum ceiling. The collective violated the covenant. They murdered 347 people. They attacked a medical vessel. They targeted the wounded, the sick, the defenseless. By every measure, they committed crimes that demanded the harshest possible response. And yet we did not respond with annihilation. We did not respond with genocide in kind. We responded with justice. We responded with restraint. Sarah paused, letting the weight of those words settle into the consciousness of every being watching. But justice without the possibility of redemption is merely revenge. And revenge was not what the Mercy's dawn represented. This ship, this vessel that was destroyed 20 years ago, represented something far more profound. The belief that even in the midst of warfare, even when civilizations are locked in mortal combat, there are principles that transcend military advantage. There are values that cannot be compromised. There is a sacred space where healing takes precedence over destruction. Ambassador stepped forward, his massive form moving with deliberate grace toward the center of the chamber. In his remaining limbs, collective physiology had partially regenerated one of his damaged appendages over the years. He carried an object that gleamed beneath the station's lights. It was a sculpture, created from salvaged debris of the original Mercy's dawn, shaped by collective artisans into an abstract form that was simultaneously terrible and beautiful. It represented destruction and renewal, violation and redemption, death and transformation. "The collective brings this offering," began his translator, rendering his clicks and chirps into measured, formal English. "Not as recompense, for there can be no adequate recompense for the taking of 347 lives. We bring it as acknowledgement of crime and as commitment to perpetual change. The collective was wrong. We violated principles that should never be violated. We murdered beings who were dedicated to healing. We proved ourselves unworthy of the trust that the galaxy had placed in us." He paused, his compound eyes seeming to reflect the infinite depth of space itself. "We will spend the next 1,000 years, the next 10,000 years, proving that we are no longer that civilization. We will educate our children to understand that the covenant is not a human construct designed to constrain our strength. It is a foundation upon which galactic civilization is built. It is the agreement that says, even in our darkest moments, even when we are engaged in existential conflict, there are boundaries that we will not cross. There are beings, the wounded, the sick, the vulnerable, who will be protected." Sarah accepted the sculpture, turning it slowly in her hands, understanding its weight both literal and symbolic. 20 years of human collective collaboration had created this object. 20 years of collective engineers and artists working alongside human counterparts, slowly rebuilding trust, slowly demonstrating through action what words could never convey. "This memorial will serve as a hospital," Sarah announced to the assembled gathering. "It will treat patients from every species, including the collective. It will train doctors and nurses from civilizations that were enemies not so long ago. It will be a place where healing transcends conflict, where compassion is not weakness, and where the sacred principle of sanctuary is honored absolutely." Behind her, the transparent aluminum ceiling revealed Earth below, humanity's, the cradle of the species that had chosen restraint over vengeance, mercy over annihilation, justice over revenge. And in the galleries of the memorial, collective and human doctors were already beginning their collaborative work, treating patients side by side, building relationships that would eventually reshape the entire galaxy's understanding of what was possible when civilizations chose principle over profit. As the ceremony concluded, and the gathered representatives began to disperse, Sarah found herself alone before the massive viewport that overlooked the infinite expanse of space. "Do you think we've learned?" asked quietly. "Both our civilizations, I mean, do you think we've genuinely learned not to cross that line again?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that the lesson isn't about never crossing the line. The lesson is about what happens when you do cross it. The collective crossed the line, and instead of being destroyed, you were forced to live with the knowledge of what you'd done. You were forced to rebuild. You were forced to prove every single day that you could be better." She turned to face the collective ambassador. "That's a far more powerful deterrent than any weapon humanity could ever develop. That's the knowledge that if you violate the sacred, you don't get the mercy of swift death. You get the burden of eternal redemption." His mandibles clicked slowly, and Sarah understood this was laughter, sad, comprehending laughter. "Then perhaps," the collective said, "we have finally earned our place among the stars." And as the two of them stood in silence, watching the infinite void, the memorial station continued its eternal rotation, its 347 names gleaming against the darkness.